Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about the character of Picard, and I want to try to answer the question, how come he never had children? Not counting, of course, his experience in the Inner Light, in which he experienced a simulation of a whole life, but it wasn't his own life. The quickest answer would be to say that he simply doesn't like children. He said so himself many times, but that was in early TNG, and I think there were plenty of episodes in which we could see that he changes his mind, including the episode The Inner Light, in which he got to experience having children, and then he realized how good it was to have children, and in many other episodes he got to spend time with children, and so he obviously changed his attitude toward children toward the end of TNG. He even had those Captain Picard days and all of that, and he was much more friendly toward children compared to how he was in the beginning of TNG, and especially I think the Inner Light would have had such a great effect on him because he even said in that episode that he never thought he needs children to complete his life, but now he doesn't know how to live without them. And even later when he was in the Nexus in the movie Generations, the Nexus basically gives you what you want most, and what we saw him get was a family and a bunch of children. And so we know that at least at that point when he entered the Nexus, that was something he did want. So this brings the question, well, why didn't he have children later? You know, a man can still have children no matter the age. And in the same movie he also spoke about how his family legacy is important to him, and now that his nephew and brother died, he now feels it's his responsibility to carry the line and all of that. And yet in the same speech he said, now there will be no more Picards, and so that brings the question, why? Are you sterile or something? You know, a man can still have children even late in life, so maybe his problem is with women, but we did see him be with a bunch of women during TNG, and even talked about having many women before that and all of that. And I think the main reason he never had a family, I think they mentioned that a few times in the show, is that he was simply so focused on his duties. He so much wanted to be a captain that he simply didn't have time for a serious relationship and to raising children and all of that. He simply devoted him completely or almost completely his career in Starfleet, even though we saw that he had a bunch of other hobbies. He could ride horses, he knew how to fence, he obviously read a lot of books, he knew a lot about history and about diplomacy and philosophy, and so he was very kind of a self-educated man in things that he didn't really have to know to be in Starfleet, even to be a captain. And so obviously he did spend a lot of time on all kinds of hobbies, you know, archaeology and so on. So technically it means he had enough time if he wanted to have a wife and children, and Starfleet obviously allows that, but maybe he thought he wouldn't be the best possible captain if he had a family on board. He wouldn't be able to make tough decisions. We saw that a little bit in the episode Lessons, in which he fell in love with a science officer and yet later had to send her on a dangerous mission, and after that he realized he cannot do both. He cannot be with her and be the captain at the same time, so that's why he broke off with her basically. So that shows his devotion to his duties, to being the captain of a starship, so he has to make this kind of personal sacrifice. Even though we saw a bunch of other captains and admirals who did have families, who did have children, so that begs the question, why couldn't Picard do that? But I think this ties to the fact that he simply didn't want to have children. And the reason that he didn't like children, I think Troy said in one episode that maybe it's because when he was a child himself, he didn't really play with other children that much, and he also said that he was so devoted to becoming a Starfleet captain that he spent all his youth only focused on that, and so he didn't play with other children so much. And maybe that has to do with the fact that he doesn't like children even as an adult. And that backstory is a little bit contradictory in my opinion, because on the one hand they always show us that Picard is such a great diplomat, that he knows how to talk with people, so obviously he has very good social skills, and yet at the same time they basically give him the backstory of kind of a nerd who never played with other children, only focused on studying to get into Starfleet and all of that. And yet he had a bunch of hobbies like fencing, like running marathons, like archaeology. So if he was so focused on Starfleet, then why did he do all those other things? So it's a little bit contradictory in my opinion. I guess horse riding makes sense because he grew up in kind of an open area because his family owned a vineyard. Maybe there were horse stables around, and so he could ride horses in his free time. And so some of it does make sense, but some of it is a little bit contradictory. Obviously, they added more things to the character as the show went on, and some of the details kind of don't really make much sense. So if he had no time to play with other children, how did he have time to have so many hobbies and to read so many books? You know, Picard is such a wise man. He was really educated and with stuff that is not required in Starfleet Academy. You know, philosophy, history. Of course, it does make him a better captain because he keeps encountering all kinds of situations, and so his vast knowledge of history, philosophy, and all of that definitely will help him out. But all that stuff is probably not required reading in Starfleet, and he only did it because it was his hobby. And so I think Picard was an extremely knowledgeable man even early on in TNG, to an almost unrealistic level. When did he have time to study so many different fields so well? So I guess that would explain that he never really invested his time in relationships. I mean, there were a lot of mentions of him being with other women, but I guess none of them were really long relationships. And by his own admission, he never really liked children. And because he had a brother who got married and had a son, he felt it wasn't his responsibility to carry his family name. And so he basically relaxed and didn't try to find himself a wife or to have kids. And during TNG, we had a bunch of episodes in which he had to interact with children and obviously changed his attitude. And even Wesley Crusher falls into that category. He was kind of his almost adoptive son in a way, because he was the son of the woman that he loved and his best friend. So he felt some kind of connection with him, and he helped him to get into Starfleet and all of that. So in some ways it was almost like a father-son relationship. Now, a lot of things happened during TNG itself which must have had a profound effect on him as a person. The first of them was his mind meld with Sarek, in which he basically gained all of his knowledge, all his experiences and memory. And later the same with Spock. He did mind meld with Spock as well. And one of Sarek's experiences was his bad relationship with his own son Spock. So maybe Picard could feel all the pain that came with that, because that relationship was so full of anger and negative emotions. So maybe Picard kind of felt all the trauma of that. And maybe it's also something that made him decide that he doesn't want to have any of that in his own life. He doesn't want to have his own children. Now, after his mind meld with Sarek, he was also assimilated by the Borg Collective, and that was obviously a very traumatic event for him. And also he gained the memories of the collective, so maybe he now had the memories and feelings of countless other people who were in the collective, and maybe it also affected his personality. It's kind of strange that he returned to normal shortly after only one episode of being kind of broken, and then was totally fine about that whole ordeal. Maybe some medical intervention was offered to him to help him deal with that, to block some of those memories and all of that. We don't really know, but that experience was obviously very traumatic for him. But I don't think that would convince him not to have children, unless, I guess, maybe he's so pessimistic about life in general now, that he's so afraid of the kind of suffering people may experience, that maybe he decided he doesn't want to have children who might suffer the same way. And maybe that experience of being tortured by a Cardassian also contributed to that kind of feeling, because that was another traumatic event when he was tortured for a few days by a Cardassian in horrible ways, and so that also must have had some traumatic effect on him. And of course, one of the most important events in his life was probably his experience in the Inner Light, in which he was given the memories of an entire lifetime of a man living on a planet. We don't really know how much of it was kind of a simulation, how much free will he actually had inside of it, or was it pure memories of a real person. But either way, he said himself that that experience was so real to him that it's as if he experienced another lifetime. And so I would say by this point of the show, Picard really should be the wisest man who ever lived, because he had not just his personal education and background, which was pretty impressive even when the show began, but then later he also mind melded with Sarek, who was a 200-year-old ambassador with a lot of experience and knowledge, and he was part of the Borg Collective and retained a lot of the memories he gained from there, and he lived a second lifetime in the episode The Inner Light, including raising children and realizing that children do give him happiness, that he does want to have children. So how come after that he still didn't do anything to achieve that? Well, maybe that event was also traumatic in a different way, because just imagine that experience. He thought he had a family, he thought that he raised children and grandchildren, and then he had all of it taken away from him, and he discovered that all of that was fake, that they were not really his children, even though those people did exist. Those were the memories of real people who existed in ancient past, and so it's not as if discovering all of that was just a simulation and totally fake, but he did find out they were not his own children. And also from his point of view, they basically all died because he suddenly found out that all of that was in the past, and that that planet went extinct, and that his entire family that he loved are all basically dead now. So just imagine that. So that must have been a very traumatic experience as well. It could have been a very enriching experience, he could have been happy about that experience, but it was definitely traumatic as well. And so that might also make him very timid about having new children of his own, because of that fear of one day waking up and all his family being dead suddenly when he's still alive. And so that probably also added some kind of fear and reluctance about raising another family, because in his mind he just raised children and a grandchild and had a wife, and suddenly at once all of them died, and he found out they were not his own children. So that must have been traumatic. And also in the last season of TNG, he found out that he has a son from a woman that he was involved with for a short time, and felt guilty about not being there for him and trying to connect with him. And in that episode, the Ferengi Bok tries to kill his son, and then in the end of the episode he finds out it's not really his own son after all. And so that might have added just a little bit more trauma, kind of similar to the Inner Light, of thinking that he has a son, starting to connect with him, starting to develop emotions for him, and then he finds out it's not really his son. So that must have been another traumatic event of gaining a son and losing him right away, and also add to that fear he had of Bok actually killing him to take revenge, and realizing that his job as a Starfleet captain, he makes a lot of enemies in the galaxy, and those enemies might go after his loved ones, his family. And so maybe this also added to his decision of not wanting to have children because of all of this. And as we saw in the episode Lessons, in which he fell in love with a woman, but decided in the end of the episode that he cannot be with her and be a captain of the ship at the same time, because that would interfere with his duties, and he made the decision that the duty of being a captain is more important to him, and he was willing to sacrifice his love with that woman. And so that basically shows us that as long as he's in Starfleet, he won't really develop any serious relationships and wouldn't have children. And later in the movie Generations, he finds out that his brother and nephew die in a horrible fire, so that's another traumatic event, which also maybe makes him afraid of having children because of that fear. He doesn't want to experience that kind of pain again, and so maybe he wouldn't want to have children because of that fear of losing a child, which he experienced a few times by now. And also in Generations we saw that his fantasy in the Nexus was actually having a family and children, and so we see that that is something that he wishes, and yet he gives that up and he goes out of the Nexus in order to carry out his duty and to save that planet and all of that. And so once again he made that kind of decision of giving up the family that he could have had in order to be a good Starfleet captain. Later on in the movie Nemesis, he meets his own clone who is much younger than him, and he has all kinds of heart-to-heart conversations with him, and there are glimpses of a kind of relationship almost father to son. And even after he finds out that Shinzon is not a nice guy, and even after he finds out about his plan to drain all of his blood to make himself live and all of that, even then in those conversations between them, you can kind of get the idea that Picard would be willing to sacrifice his own life to help Shinzon live if Shinzon would choose the good path. If he does something good with his life, then maybe Picard would willingly sacrifice himself for him. He didn't say directly, but it was kind of implied. And yet Shinzon was basically evil, and so Picard had to kill him. And then you can see again some kind of trauma So we can say that this was almost like a repeating pattern. So we can add this to the long list of traumas that Picard experienced every time he bonds with someone who is almost like a son to him, and then something horrible happens. And so maybe because of all of these events, he decided that he doesn't want to have children, because then someday in the future maybe something horrible would happen to that child, and so on. So I think it is understandable after so many traumatic experiences that he wouldn't want that. And when we saw his future in the last episode of TNG and saw him working at the vineyard, there was no clue to him having children or an extended family. It was mentioned that he was married to Beverly Crusher, but then they got divorced. So presumably after he returned to the present, he didn't make all the same mistakes. He did tell his crew about all the bad things in the future so that they can prevent those things. And presumably he never married Dr. Crusher because he knew it will not work out. And so maybe he told her that, and they decided there's no point to do it if they know that it ends badly. And so obviously he couldn't have had children with her. And as we saw in Star Trek Picard, if you consider that canon, he became an admiral and later left Starfleet after Starfleet disappointed him. And then for almost 20 years he lived in his vineyard and spent his time writing books and stuff like that. So that begs the question, why didn't he try to start a family then? You could argue maybe he was too old by that point. He was over 80 or even 90 years old. Kind of too late to start a family. But again, you know, with 24th century technology and him being a man, technically that should be possible, either by finding a younger woman or maybe with medical technology this would be possible, but maybe he just didn't want to after experiencing so many traumas in his life, all the times in which he almost had children and then found out that it's all fake or false or a simulation and all of that. I guess it makes sense why he wouldn't want to risk another trauma. And I kind of wish they would have brought up some of these events I mentioned in the show itself, because maybe that would explain why he was such a broken man at this point in time. Why is he so pessimistic and all of that? It's not just because Starfleet disappointed him, but maybe because of all the many traumas he's experienced. We can say that Picard basically lived multiple lifetimes. We can say that from his point of view, he has the memory of multiple lifetimes. That should also make him a really wise man, which he was very wise even early on in TNG, but after so many unique experiences, after gaining so much memory from different people and all of that, he really should feel as if he lived enough, like he doesn't want to live forever. That could have been used to explain why he didn't go back to the Baku planet. He had the opportunity to live much longer or even forever on the Baku planet. He was invited there and yet never went there. Apparently maybe he spent some time there, we don't really know. And even later when they made him an android in the end of Picard, he was kind of worried of being immortal. Like he doesn't want to be immortal, maybe he wants to die because from his point of view he experienced several lifetimes already, so maybe he's kind of ready to die and doesn't want to live any longer, especially with all the memory of all the bad things, all the traumas he had. And also because he trained so many people in Starfleet, maybe he kind of views them as his children, all his former crew, all the officers he helped train. Maybe he views them almost as children, and so he doesn't really have the need to have his own child. And so I think we can explain this, and it would make sense, especially since he always said he doesn't really want children, even though it would have been nice to find out that, you know, after his retirement, maybe he did get married, he didn't have children. I think that would have been interesting and nice to know and not be so depressing. I guess technically they can still shoehorn that in. Maybe he has children he doesn't know of. Maybe, you know, maybe Vash had a child without his knowledge. Or maybe he had children during his time in the vineyard after his retirement and he simply didn't mention it. Maybe, you know, the wife took the kids. So we can technically invent all kinds of stories like that, but it was never shown on screen, and so technically, canonically, he doesn't have any children, and now he's an android, so maybe it's not even possible anymore. So that's kind of sad in a way, because, you know, there will be no more Picards unless maybe all his memories will get downloaded to a younger body, and then maybe that person will call himself or herself Picard and then have children. So I guess it's all possible, but we can say that the character of Picard is pretty much at the end of his life and without any biological legacy. And, you know, because Picard is such a wise character, because he has so much knowledge which he gathered, and also all his unique experience, it would be kind of a sad ending to know that he just died and didn't leave anything behind. So maybe it would be a cool idea to say that all his memories got transferred to someone else, or to some kind of archive, somehow got stored, because otherwise all of those unique experiences and memories will get lost forever. And that's kind of a sad thought. So anyway, that's all I wanted to talk about for today. So I covered a lot of the history and the events of the life of Jean-Luc Picard, and specifically talked about his decision not to have children. So let me know what you think. We can continue talking about it in the comment section below. Please like the video, please share, subscribe, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.